Hey guys, I'm filming this the second time because the first time I filmed it, I had no audio on, so that's really awesome. Yeah. Okay, welcome to my episode about Tibet. This is about Tibet's cruel annexation because of China. And I've been researching this for weeks now. I actually spent 8 hours yesterday on my Sunday continuing rewrites on it. So I've been hard at work. I've been hard working trying to get all angles of this, trying to not, have just one biased take on it all. And so I think that this is going to be a really great video that's condensed with a lot of information that's really core about Tibet. You're going to learn some history about China and just mainly how that really goes with Tibetan history as well. You're going to learn a lot about geopolitics. There's going to be some talk about the climate in China and how China's fucking climate change and how that's fucking Tibet as well. So I'll also talk about why that's important. And we're going to talk about the controversial topic of slavery in Tibet. Was it real? There's a lot of stuff we're going to talk about. So sit back and enjoy what I have to go over for the umpteenth time. I'm so sorry. I've filmed this 5 times already. I'm not even joking. Alright. At least this time will probably be my best read time of it. I had a few mistakes when I was previously doing it. I was like, oh, whatever. Maybe it'll be better this time. Who knows? Okay, without further ado, let's get into it. So, first things first, let's talk about Tibetan history and background. So, the population of the region is almost entirely Tibetan, with Han Chinese and Hui Chinese Muslims, Momba, Loba, and other minority nationalities. Thus, the majority of people speak, the same language, their same ethnic origin, and have traditionally practiced the same religion. The overwhelming majority of Tibetans traditionally have been Buddhists, and before the 1950s, prayer flags flew from every home, adorned the mountain slopes, monasteries were established throughout the country, and the Dalai Lama, the spiritual head of Tibetan Buddhism, was the supreme political head of the nation. A minority, however, were adherents of Islam, Hinduism, Bon, Christianity. In the year 670, what? Okay. In the year 670, which is 20 years after Songbird-san Tsangpo's death, peace with China was broken, and for 2 centuries, Tibetan armies in the Qinghai and Xinjiang area kept the frontier in a state of war. In alliance with the Western Turks, the Tibetans challenged Chinese control of the trade routes through Central Asia, and they actually did a really good job of it too. The Tibetan Empire was at its peak from 618 to 842, and after 842 marks the period beginning the dissolution of the empire period. During the decline of the Yuan dynasty, Central Tibet was ruled by successive families from the 14th to the 17th centuries, with the Dalai Lama's rule succeeding the 17th to the 18th centuries. However, Tibet has always been de facto independent from the 14th century onwards, being independent for nearly 400 years. The Ming dynasty, however, from 1368 to 1644, had made very little effort to impose direct ruling over Tibet. It had made nominal claims by establishing the Yutsang Military Commission. They made an effort to keep friendly relations with some of the Buddhist religious leaders, and they even granted some titles to local leaders. An important effect of the Manchu supremacy was the exclusion of foreigners from after 1792. This ended the hopes of Christian missionaries and diplomatic visits from British India, which had been started in 1774. Tibet was now closed, and mutual ignorance enshrouded future exchanges with its British neighbours in India. In 1913, the 13th Dalai Lama expelled Chinese troops and officials from Tibet, and for the next 37 years, Tibet functioned as an independent nation free from Chinese control, and established its own government during this period. During this time, Tibet was also recognized as independent by foreign countries such as the British Empire, who also had a treaty with Tibet in 1904. The 13th Dalai Lama died in 1933, unfortunately. Because then right after that, in 1950 to 1951, China sought out Tibet as they believed Tibet was a part of China, and so the peaceful annexation of Tibet was branded as reunification. The allegation that Tibet has been ruled by China previously is watery at best, and isn't really that good of an excuse to annex a whole country. While Tibet had some cultural ties with China in the past, they are neighbours after all, and interactions are going to happen over the span of hundreds of years. Tibet always maintained a distinct identity separate from China, including having its own government, culture, and religious practices. China says that during the Mongol Empire and Yuan dynasty, Tibet was under their rule during this time. As a matter of fact, Tibet had settled peace with the Mongolian Empire in exchange for protection. And so Tibet would offer the Mongols religious enlightenment and prosperity. They were not integrated with their central system. On March 10th, 1959, Chinese authorities had invited the Dalai Lama to a theatrical performance at their military headquarters. Tibetans were suspicious of this and surrounded the Dalai Lama's palace in Lhasa to prevent him from going. China viewed this as an insurgency outbreak of an armed rebellion against Chinese authorities. They were inevitably suppressed by the Chinese army. This rebellion, I think we can look at as trying to protect their spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, and I feel like very understandable action by them. After this occurred, the Dalai Lama finally fled to India on March 19th, and the Dalai Lama went into exile at just 15 years of age. Since the Chinese at times have attempted to eliminate the influence of religion in Tibetan life, that religion which is essential to their history and culture. Tibetan's economy, although rich in mineral resources, mostly remained underdeveloped. There were surveys performed of the Kalai and Marpam districts in western Tibet. They were conducted in the 30s and 40s, and discovered extensive gold fields, large deposits of borax, as well as reserves of radium, iron, titanium, lead, and arsenic. Subsequent investigative teams, dispatched from the 1950s onward, reported the existence of a huge variety of minerals and ores. The most significant of these include large copper deposits around Kulong, east of Lhasa, and Yulong, some 85 miles, 140 kilometers east of Chengdu, near the border with Sichuan province. Graphite obtained from Ningjin and coal exported to be plentiful around Chengdu. Deposits of iron ore and concentrated seams of high quality and extractable depth found in the Tangula Mountains on the Tibet-Qinghai border, and oil-bearing formations, a reserve of oil shales, chromium ore, or chromite, lithium, lead, zinc, and manganese deposits. So very bountiful deposits there. About 20 to 25% of Tibetans lead a nomadic life, meaning they live off the land and they do not stay in one place for very long. Those living in pastoral areas are called nomads or pastoralists. These people sometimes build houses as home bases and storage, especially for winter, because winter can be quite rough. Otherwise, they live in a nomadic life with a nomadic tent and with their nomadic little animals. Their nomadic existence has actually permeated their culture, and Tibetan nomads have a lot in common with Mongolian nomads, actually. The Tibetan nomads have found it increasingly difficult to live their lives this way because in the past decade, their pastures get cordoned off by China, and then China forces them to sell their animals and move into housing units. The nomadic way of life has been closed off due to bureaucracy. 70% of Tibetans are actually classified as rural, according to Chinese government figures in 2018. Tibetans lead rural farmer lives due to the mountainous and challenging terrain of Tibet. And Tibetan villages are usually self-sufficient and associated with monasteries or lords. Land is often distributed by these people based on needs of families and quality of land, often getting a little bit of both. There is no denying that Tibetans led a simple and primitive life before China involved itself. However, it is disgusting to me that the Chinese would confiscate what little possessions nomads had and then force them into communes, completely altering the way that they live their life. Their animals were their entire life. It was their wealth. It was their way of living. The nomads would even go they'd even wear jewelry such as earrings, and there's been reports of Chinese confiscating those too, and sometimes going as far as to rip the jewelry right off of them. Nomad families that go along with the government's wishes sign long-term contracts for state-owned land. The size of the plot is determined by the family's size and the number of animals they have. They are given money for fencing and access to yak sperm banks. Nomads who don't go along with the government's wishes face fines. Doesn't sound that much better than the previous system. Another issue about the fencing policy is that it breaks down a centuries-old way of life for the nomads. Access to drinking water is cut off and vastly restricted, and migration routes for animals are blocked. This will in turn cause more environmental damage and make things much worse than just simply letting the animals roam. And now, the times you are allowed to perform the nomadic roam are completely fixed by government regulations. So, why does China think it deserves to annex Tibet? I want to start this off with a quote. "No country is allowed to invade, occupy, annex, and colonize another country just because its social structures does not please it." As we said, China thinks it historically has a claim over Tibet. These claims have particular resonance among people who share the same assumption based on 19th century Western theories of social evolution. The theory is still widely accepted in China, and that is that certain forms of society are backwards and should be helped to evolve by more advanced societies. Wow, that could be taken in a lot of different ways, huh?
Go back to your own country!
This form of prejudice converges with some earlier Chinese views and with some very vulgar Marxist theories that imagine a vanguard movement liberating the oppressed classes or nationalities in society, whether or not those classes actually agree that they're being oppressed. The question of whether Tibet was feudal in the past is actually irrelevant. A more immediate question is why the People's Republic of China doesn't allow open discussion of whether Tibet was feudal or oppressive. Writers and researchers in Tibet face serious repercussions if they do not concur with the official positions on issues such as social conditions in Tibet, especially prior to its liberation. And in such a restrictive climate, the regime's claims on this issue have very little credibility. So, again, was Tibet feudal like China claims? Most scholars agree that Tibet's society saw people working on estates owned by nobles, monasteries, or the state, and they paid taxes to them. This is well formally documented too, and honestly doesn't sound that much different than what we have today, right? Most experts do not see them as slaves, which could be bought and sold. In fact, likening Tibet's system to slavery has certain connotations and assumptions that are not truthful whatsoever. Tibet did not have chattel slavery or slave markets. In fact, serfs had full control over their possessions, which meant they were able to amass considerable wealth. And combining this with the fact that their land tenure was formally recorded, the lords couldn't alter their demands at their every whim. Serfs also had the right to initiate legal disputes against their lords, although this was rare. Nevertheless, they had the right to bring their case to the central government. They had their time in court. That being said, lords did hold the dominant position and exercise their adjudicative privileges as well as punishment and imprisonment rights over serfs. So I'm not saying it was great, but we're gonna learn later in the essay that what they're having now is not much different. Serfs had many subcategories, but the two main ones were the Kalpa, which means taxpayer, or the one who does the taxes, and the Dud Chung is the second one, meaning small smoke. That translates to small householder. The Kalpa taxpayers were more prestigious. Tibet has never had a term for slave. They don't even have a word for it. These people were not commodities. It was like a peasant-lord type relationship. Historically, the Dalai Lama did not even directly own serfs, but he was seen as the sovereign of Tibetan society. So therefore, everyone was his subject, much like the people in the UK are subjects to the king or the crown. They're subjects to the crown. In the end, it is decided that Tibet's system wasn't outright slavery, but varying degrees of contracted and obligational serfdom. Again, that is a very brief rundown of what it was like, but I'm just trying to highlight the fact that China calling it a slavery system is not correct. Next, I want to talk about China's oppression of the Tibetan people and human rights violations. China's Cultural Revolution and book burning. During China's Cultural Revolution in 1966, Chinese Red Guards, a paramilitary social movement, confiscated and burned religious texts and figures. In other instances, items of historical importance were left in place but defaced, and around August 8th of 1966, the Red Guard was formed in Tibet Lhasa as well. And thus the Cultural Revolution began the destruction of Tibetan prayer flags, religious art, and sacred texts. The people of Tibet were also mercilessly beaten and shamed publicly. Although many temples in Tibet were destroyed prior to the Cultural Revolution, in September 1966, many of the remaining temples and monasteries were destroyed using dynamite and artillery, reducing them to nothing but rubble. Libraries were looted and rare books were taken. Sacred Buddhist scriptures and paintings were burned. Fortunately, many Tibetan monks had managed to hide and protect their rare texts, and most notably, a collection of 300-year-old texts that had never been published, never before seen published text. They were scrawled in cinnabar and a black ink, detailing tantric rituals of Buddhist deities. Thanks to an American scholar who embarked on a mission to preserve Tibetan culture, or what was left of it, Ellis Jean Smith joined the Library of Congress in 1968. That's the year the Chinese Red Guards were actually dissolved. Ellis began his project, which was to reprint the Tibetan books that had been brought from exiled Tibetans. In 1999, he founded the Tibetan Buddhist Resource Center to digitize a 12,000-volume corpus of Tibetan literature. Now, the reason why I'm highlighting this part of history is so important is because it adds some great context to the amount of loss the Tibetans have already suffered. It also brings up a question of what books exactly were taken. It's quite possible that there was a lot of historic records and literature about Tibetan society that were potentially burned by the Chinese Red Guards. It's possible that important records have been lost, and thus proof of their civilization culture lost with it. We see even interviews with exiled Tibetans revealing how the Chinese authorities imprisoned Tibetans for peaceful political expression such as leafletting, putting up posters, flying the Tibetan flag, distributing the writings of the Dalai Lama, shouting slogans, teaching other Tibetans about their history and culture. It just doesn't sound that great to me. It doesn't sound like a liberation that's had a positive impact. Next, I want to talk about the additional components of the Cultural Revolution. Unfortunately, the effects of the Cultural Revolution didn't end with book and scripture burning. No. Didn't end with stealing cultural historic statues made of gold, silver, and bronze, the Tibetans were going to suffer far more. With the closing down of their schools, monks and nuns were forced to marry or be sent to labour camps. Teachers and academics were reviled as intellectuals and subjected to public struggle sessions. And more than 6,000 monasteries and religious institutions were in ruins. Millions of ancient and priceless manuscripts were burnt. It is said that at least 92,000 Tibetans were subjected to struggle sessions, died, or committed suicide, and around 173,000 Tibetans died in prison or in reform through labour camps. In the current day, China's strike hard and patriotic re-education campaigns have maintained a chokehold on religious institutions. Lamas must be appraised by Beijing first, and they force Tibetans to denounce the Dalai Lama, their spiritual leader. Even today, the harsh policies have led to executions, imprisonment, destruction of religious institutions, political indoctrination, expulsion of monks and nuns, banning of religious ceremonies, restricting the number of monks and monasteries, and enforcing loyalty to the Chinese party. China themselves have even made it clear that they want to establish Chinese as the primary language to all minority regions by the end of 2020, as it is stated in their 5-year plan. Their 13th 5-year plan, that is, which we'll get into a little bit more detail later on. Next, I want to talk about Tibetan protests and martial law. In 1989, a martial law decree for Tibet, as well as a decree on re-education, was made. The report illustrates the extent of China's repression and the ongoing violation of basic human rights in Tibet. Through arbitrary arrest, torture, unfair trials, and secular takeover of religion, and the absence of freedom of association, expression, and assembly. From the period of 1987 to 1989, it was a period of Tibetan unrest. Protests had begun shortly after the Dalai Lama had been exiled. The people of Tibet had been arguing that Tibet was a fully independent state when the People's Liberation Army first invaded from 49 to 50. At first, protesters were monks, peaceful, calling for independence, waving their country's flag. China arrested them. After that, they became violent. Tensions rose and things got out of order. The violent protests continued for 3 days, and Chinese police shot many unarmed civilians in an attempt to restore order. Now, how these initially became violent in the first place is a disputed thing. Tibetans will say that police threw bottles at the protesters, which sparked retaliation. The Chinese say that there were Tibetan snipers that had shot their police. It's hard to say what happened. Now, the Chinese love to characterize these protesters as a small clique of people who support the Dalai Lama, who really liked the previous system of being like lords or whatever. The fact that they arrested hundreds of Tibetans suspected of being demonstrators of opposition, and considering the fact that to this day they're still arresting people for suspect of separatism. Foreign travellers and journalists were told to leave, and over the next 3 years, more demonstrations of protest continue to occur in various sizes. Inevitably, the protests ended with the introduction of martial law on March 8th, and martial law lasted over a year. Now you tell me, does that sound like a group of tiny little group of people who are like, yeah, we like the Dalai Lama? The fact that they continue to protest in the face of such oppression and ruthlessness is admirable to me. And we do have some Western accounts of what happened during the first initial protests, but it's hard to say. It's estimated to be around 450 Tibetans were killed during this time, but factually we just don't have the information. Another thing I want to highlight is the fact that journalists aren't even allowed in Tibet. Journalists' requests and applications to report in Tibet in 2023 were all denied. During this time, strict COVID measures were used as excuses, and diplomats and tourists were also getting routinely denied. Tibet is the only province in China that actually requires reporters to officially apply for permission to enter. There's a notable case here about the truth getting out and being punished. The story of Tashi Wangchuk, a Tibetan language activist who was imprisoned for 5 years. The reason? Inciting separatism. All because he appeared in a New York Times documentary calling for language rights in Tibet. Got it. Self-immolation protests began to arise, and the controversial form of protest was being used as a statement of opposition to the Chinese government repressing Tibetans. Since 2009, 157 Tibetans have performed self-immolation protest. I think commonly monks and nuns are the ones doing it. We are fortunate enough with the technology growing in the world that communication with Tibetans is still possible, and journalists are still able to get information from people living there, but it is highly risky and can be flawed. Except I just want to highlight the lengths that China will go to prevent information from coming out. They go to extreme lengths for it. Next, I want to talk about the pollution of Tibet by China and the exploitation of their resources. As we know, they're plentiful in many minerals, and so they should have a prosperous economy given how many minerals China is able to take from them. However, under Chinese rule, Tibetans are impoverished, marginalized, excluded. The sensitive and globally important ecology of Tibet is deteriorating, and many plant and animal species face extinction. Tibet comprises 1/8 of the land of China and is, as I said, rich in mineral ores. Since cyanide is used as a processing agent by gold mining industries, this affects the downstream areas of the Tibetan illegal mining operations. And the nature of the mining activity is such that it provides absolutely nothing to the local Tibetan communities, other than a few unskilled and unsafe job opportunities that are often risky and toxic. China's claim that the modernization and development of Tibet was the sole reason behind building the almost 2,000-kilometer Siling Lhasa Railway. In fact, 16 large copper, lead, zinc, iron, and possibly crude oil deposits exist along this very railway line, as the most probable cause for China to spend a colossal whopping $3.7 billion on this very railway. The ecosystem of Tibet is not only important for the inhabitants of Tibet, but it has an impact on the environment as a whole of Asia, due to Tibet being the source of the larger rivers, and also because the Tibetan Plateau controls the monsoon patterns, as clearly established by scientists. The immediate effects of all this are going to be felt in India, China, Burma, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and other countries downstream. Not only environmental effects, but local Tibetans who film and release the illegal mining operations have been imprisoned for bringing these actions to light on social media. China's dam operations. Now, this is going to be a doozy of a section, but please bear with me, it's all relevant. China is the world's biggest source of carbon dioxide, responsible for around 28% of global emissions. According to China's very own publications, they have been exploring early possibilities of emission control, saying the country's carbon dioxide emissions per unit of GDP will be lowered by 18% from the 2020 level by 2025, this year. And they will have dropped more than 65% compared to the 2005 level by 2030, 5 years from now. An analysis of China's emissions shows they actually increased emissions by 12% between 2020 and 2023, and after a highly energy and carbon intensive response to the COVID pandemic. Carbon Brief informs us that China once again reiterated this desire to reach their emission metrics at the 2021 14th Five-Year Plan meeting. This basically is a meeting that China would set to explore and sign economic roadmaps. It's kind of like this is what we're going to achieve, and this is how we're going to do it. But it has evolved into something more over time, such as setting targets and goals to achieve in order to improve the country. They actually adopted this method from Stalin, interestingly, and it's been around for a very long time. And now, a message from my sponsor, me. Guys, if you haven't checked out my Redbubble yet, please do have a look. I have a lot of cool designs. I enjoy doing fandom stuff, but I've got this really cute Rock Hyrax awhile shirt. It's probably one of my favorite designs, but there's a lot of other cool stuff there too, and I do upload my fan art there as well when it's appropriate. So go check it out. The link is in the description below. Bye! At the moment, an 18 to 20% reduction of CO2 intensity during the 14th 5-year plan period would put the country on a trajectory towards carbon neutrality by 2060. However, since 2023, China has been severely off track. Coal consumption growth has actually increased 8-fold, from 0.5% to a whopping 3.8%. Their target for carbon intensity, as I stated earlier, is reduced by minus 18%, and it has only decreased by minus 1.5% per year. So in order for them to achieve their targets by 2025, this current year, they would need to jump their carbon intensity reduction to minus 7 per year. I've got a nice little picture that I can put up there to show you what I'm talking about. Next, I want to talk about the Yarlung Tsangpo Dam. The Yarlung Tsangpo Dam project was announced in November 2020 and was approved for works finally in December 2024. It is the world's largest hydroelectric project, China's largest, really. The Yarlung Tsangpo is 3 times deeper on average than the Grand Canyon and is considered the Earth's deepest, possibly longest canyon in the world. The Yarlung Tsangpo becomes the Brahmaputra River as it's leaving Tibet and flows south into India's Arunachal Pradesh and Assam states. Finally, it goes into Bangladesh. China having sole control over the flow of the Yarlung Tsangpo River could result in China having a chokehold on India's economy due to the power to control or divert the flow of the trans-border river. China's foreign ministry has previously responded to India's concerns around this proposed dam, and China said that they had a legitimate right to dam the river, and they'd already considered the downstream impacts. China really just said, I've considered it, I don't give a fuck. Figure it out yourselves. So not only could China have control over India's economy by holding water hostage, the dam could have vast environmental impacts and effects on migrations of spawning fish. Now, I don't know if salmon is really a problem here. I don't know if that's like a thing that they worry about over there. But it could also permanently submerge or displace ecological human communities as the reservoirs fill. And additionally, hydroelectric dams are vulnerable to water scarcity. Although I do think that the Yarlung Tsangpo Dam has actually got a pretty high precipitation in that area. I don't know if they would be vulnerable to that specifically, but it's going to have some effects on the biodiversity as well. Next, I'm going to explain the Tibetan Plateau. The Tibetan Plateau is Tibet's most ecologically diverse area, host to numerous amounts of wildlife such as the Tibetan wolf, snow leopards, wild yak, various birds, buffalo, even wild ass. Yep, that wild ass. And not only is the Tibetan Plateau key for a lot of wildlife, but as I said before, Tibetan nomadic life actually thrives there. Or it did in the past. In fact, pastoral nomads constitute 40% of the ethnic Tibetan population. And in earlier years, their survival was predicated on how well they could raise livestock on the grasslands, rather than crops, as they are unsuitable for that terrain. And the Tibetan Empire even developed from the 7th to the 9th century from the Tibetan Plateau. Tibetan climate change worry. Tibet is known as the third pole of our planet due to its vast ice reserves, and it serves as the principal watershed for Asia. China even calls Tibet its #1 water tower, and as climate change and resource exploitations have led to rapid glacial melting, it is affecting the water flow in major Asian rivers. The exploitation of water resources has caused landslides, floods, pollution impacting downstream regions that depend on these rivers. And over the past 5 decades, 80% of the glaciers in the Tibetan Plateau have retreated. The Qinghai Tibet Plateau has a population of over 10 million people. The infrastructure, the power lines, roads, railways, they will sustain heavy damage due to permafrost thaw. That's 60% of the current infrastructure at risk, costing China potentially $6.3 billion, not to mention the displacement of millions and millions of people. So that's here we kind of say China has a vested interest in reducing their carbon emissions for more reasons than one. This is just another one that I think is not really talked about that much. I mean, imagine how cruel it would be that they'd have millions of people without power, roads, railways. All the infrastructure that they spent money on building will just collapse. Interestingly, the site of the development for the dam is along a earthquake-prone tectonic plate boundary, which Chinese researchers have actually flagged as a concern because such extensive excavation and construction in the steep and narrow gorge would actually increase the frequency of landslides. It's a very tricky project. The project could cost as much as $1 trillion or $127 billion, according to estimates by the Chongyi Water Resources Bureau. The mega dam could produce as much as 3 times the hydroelectric power of China's current largest dam, the Three Gorges, a project which also forced the relocation of 1.4 million people. According to the state-backed Global Times newspaper, the Yarlung Tsangpo Dam will be built in Meidog County. They only have a population of 14,000 people, and it is intended to be developed as a single-phase installation, and commercial operations are planned to begin in 2033. Tibetans consider the site to be one of their most sacred regions. The dam's construction is expected to significantly alter downstream flow patterns, as I said, impact local biodiversity, and since the area is already quite seismically active, it will be prone to even more landslides. And what this means is that as the dam's reservoirs fill, geological stability could be heavily affected since it's so deep and the topography is so narrow. While China is insisting that the project will be key in making Beijing climate neutral, they assure us that the dam will have minimal impact on the local environment, but they have been unable to release a report proving and addressing specific impact assessment. And then we can go off of historical facts that we have. Water security is a deep concern here. China's previous dam project on the Mekong River, their upstream water control has been associated with increased drought frequency and severity downstream regions over the past 20 years. While India's economy will probably face a blow, their water access is going to be compromised. Biodiversity will be disrupted. India will likely face riverbank erosion similar to what Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia have also struggled with, also due to Chinese hydroelectric projects. Unfortunately, India's only option here is to retaliate by constructing their own large-scale dam and reservoir system, hopefully to mitigate China's impact, but this solution is also going to undoubtedly affect regions downstream India too. So it's also not a great solution to a problem that didn't need to be there in the first place. Next I want to talk about how other countries view China and Tibet at UN meetings. There was recently a review on China. China has this thing where they review... The UN reviews countries, I think, and China's obviously going to have one of them. And during this review, the Chinese delegation actually accused governments who are being critical of its human rights record as being unfactual and prejudiced. The truth is, this is a highly contentious part of history of Tibet, and there is no academic agreement on much. The system in Tibet isn't a one-for-one copy of feudalism like China alleges. However, it is difficult to find sources that aren't too biased from one or the other. It is clear, though, that China has a vested interest in maintaining the narrative that they peacefully liberated Tibet, sorry. The fact that there are leftists talking about that, they speak so confidently about China being a strictly force for good in regards to Tibet, is actually really worrying, and I think it should call into question the legitimacy of these individuals. And even if Tibet was in a feudal state and China liberated them from that, there is undeniable evidence that China has become the feudal lord of Tibet. In terms of how the UN views the China-Tibet, countless countries are calling for China to relinquish Tibet. Of course, just asking them to do that isn't really going to make anything happen. But a lot of countries are condemning China for what they've done. Interestingly though, initially when China was first approaching Tibet in the 50s, the Dalai Lama did make his case to the UN, and at the time the UN was like, sorry, you're not independent. See how that turned out. Okay, this is very juicy. I want to talk about the Dalai Lama receiving money from the CIA. I actually read the declassified CIA document about America and Tibet. It's called Covert Action in High Altitude and was approved for release in 2016. Now, while of course this is a CIA document, they are biased. It's important to highlight misinformation and propaganda where it's clear. Very fair. But I read it was a short read, and I think it highlighted some important dates. It is important to let you know that the Dalai Lama was actually open about his meeting with the CIA in his memoir, My Land, My People, which was actually published in 1962. Some people speculate that America manufactured the reputation of the Dalai Lama, when actually the Dalai Lama's internationally renowned reputation really took off when he received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989. That year also happened to be the year of the Tiananmen Square massacre. Needless to say, China has been being a bit of a CUNT and was obviously on a lot of people's minds, so therefore giving the Dalai Lama this prize in a time of government ruthlessness and oppression, this is clearly an open action of repudiation against China. So yes, the CIA reached out to the Dalai Lama around 1950 to 1951 to open up the discussion of them helping the Tibetan people. You know, enemy of my enemy is my friend. Basically, they were going to give him weapons and training. The American government also pledged to financially support the Dalai Lama, his family, and a retinue of approximately 100 other persons. They also said that they were willing to support resistance now and in the future, providing material support they said may also be feasible. It ended up not being that feasible, actually. During that time, if they were to fly planes and do drops in Tibet, very difficult. The airspace around there was quite hostile. So that ended up not really being feasible. On the 17th of September, the terms for American support were outlined and sent to the Dalai Lama, and there were two preconditions for that. Number one, the Dalai Lama had to go into exile either in India, Ceylon, or Thailand, or wherever was closest to Tibet. The closer, the better. The second condition was the Dalai Lama had to maintain his principle that Tibet was an independent state and sovereignty. So the Dalai Lama was open to this meeting, but understandably he was cautious. Agreeing to these two conditions would plunge Tibet into guerrilla war. The US would have been very happy for Tibet to become a second front against Beijing during the Korean War. But the Dalai Lama wasn't enthusiastic about allowing his country to go to war when it was extremely probable that they would lose. Instead, he went to Lhasa once again to try and work out a deal. Another reason why during the 1950-1951 period is that they just did not have an army. They didn't have the sizable forces, whereas China had the training, they had the numbers, they had everything they needed to back them up. Whereas in Tibet, I think because the monasteries, like, they were so focused on like living their peacefulness, the monks and the nuns, by the time that they were actually starting to train and like, oh shit, we gotta defend ourselves, it was too late. So it is confirmed by the CIA that they did train Tibetan guerrilla agents in Colorado, and their acting secretary at the time, Secretary Ball, questioned the long-term utility of guerrilla operations in Tibet, fearing that they represented merely a pinprick rather than any serious harassment to the Chinese. However, they continued training and recruiting to increase guerrilla forces. The training concept planned to build 3 teams of men who were self-sufficient enough to be sent back to Tibet, Lhasa and Golmo, on the West China border, and these agents were to resettle in these areas, and assuming they could find support among the population there, ultimately building a local underground resistance unit, or multiple units, that is. But in the end, in 1972, the Tibetan guerrillas were considered a wasting force politically. So funds were approved to resettle them, and although they resisted dispersal, eventually they had to yield, and their dreams of a free Tibet were gone. The Tibetans were now considered to be completely on their own. It seems like a core part of why this didn't work is because Tibet has a rather sparse population. The barren plains don't lend themselves particularly to densely populated, banding together type vibes, so I think that's a reason why it didn't really work. The document also goes on to state that America's initial primary goal was to cause economic drain on the already struggling Chinese economy. And while it is true that the 15-year-old Dalai Lama accepted financial help from America, it's not the headline that everyone would have you believe. Yes, in the 60s, the Dalai Lama's administration received $1.7 million a year. The funds were, however, allocated for the resistance movement and spent training volunteers. We're going to talk about the infamous suck my tongue incident that the Dalai Lama caused. Oh boy. So, the characterization of this incident has been pretty ridiculous and blown like way out of proportion. In Tibet, sticking out your tongue is a way of greeting, and it has been a tradition since the 9th century. This is known because of the rather unpopular king called Long Dharma, who was well known for his black tongue. When people in Tibet thought the king had been reborn, they would show their tongue to prove they were not him. So it is a traditional greeting now that is also a form of respect. Now the phrase, suck my tongue, is translated from chele sa, which roughly translates to eat my tongue. Jigme Uden, a second-generation Tibetan refugee living in the US, explained how this is a display of affection born out of a game that was played between Tibetan children and the elderly. It is not uncommon for children to kiss their grandparents on the forehead, touch noses, then kiss. Then, as tradition, the grandfather says, "I've given you everything, so now the only thing left for you is to eat my tongue." The word suck in Tibetan language is also jip, and is not one of a sexualized manner. It is highly speculated that China was behind the video, and while I'd love to sit on that side of the fence, I think cultural shock here is understandably at play, and I mean, it's possible that China will like, oh yeah, no one's gonna understand what this means. But anyway, I did notice a lot though while trying to even make this essay and investigating, so much open Chinese propaganda, so many websites that popped up from China themselves talking about all this stuff. And it's such clear propaganda, it's crazy. We have to realize that the power of the internet, manufactured virality, is a weapon we should not forget about. It is quite relevant in the current today. Every country is using it. Social media is absolutely being weaponized at a large scale. And I think we've got to be very cautious about it. Even if it's possible maybe it wasn't China. I do still think cultural shock. It does make sense, you know? It does. We all live different cultural lives. Lastly, I want to talk about why Tibet matters. Why am I even talking about this right now? The subject of Tibet and its cruel annexation is a worrying matter to us all. Especially now, considering China is, at this very moment, claiming the state of Arunachal Pradesh and the Aksai Chin in Ladakh as part of its territory. China is calling it South Tibet, or Zanyan in Chinese. China is justifying this by saying that their historical ties to Lhasa, Tibet, now means there's an ancient precedent that Arunachal Pradesh and Aksai Chin are their territory. Where does the line get drawn? Where does the greed and overzealous seek to control end? And I know this is a controversial take too, apparently, but Russia taking over Crimea in suspicious circumstances and attempting to take over Ukraine, like, these situations are startling, and they send a message to everybody on the planet, and it leaves us in a really unsettling time where it feels like there isn't really much you can do. There isn't really much your country is willing to do. Understandably. I think the subject of Tibet is sort of like a smoking gun for political commentators, in my opinion. Tibetan children aren't learning their native language because it simply isn't feasible anymore. Their parents are urging them to learn Mandarin because, of course, they have to. Their nomadic way of life is cut off completely and bureaucratized senselessly. Their only option now is to go to free boarding schools because local schools were shut down. Do you see what's happening here? And then these boarding schools are horrific places where Tibetan children are relentlessly bullied and sometimes even killed. And I'm supposed to watch a political commentator tell me that that's just like normal school stuff? That's not normal. And you can't tell me that's normal. And in the end, what choice do they really have? You get to be indoctrinated at an early age that China is fantastic, yet you're not allowed to communicate with people outside your territory? Okay. And people can say, oh, America makes you pledge allegiance every day. You have a flag at every home and classroom. It's totally a preposterous and silly argument to even think about making. The two are not comparable whatsoever, and it's incredibly disingenuous to even make that claim. I'll admit, as an Australian looking at that stuff, you know, it is kind of weird. It's kind of wild. Our patriotism, I think I had to sing, like, the national anthem, like, maybe once a week. I fucking hated it. Made me less patriotic, if anything. Our anthem sucks. I mean, who even has, like, a good anthem, right? But patriotism is not enforced nearly to the same degree that Chinese patriotism is. It just isn't. And to pretend that it is ridiculous. And at the very least, if you decide that you don't love your country, America, that's okay. You're actually quite free to criticize your own government. Think the people of Tibet can do that? Abso-fucking-lutely not. People are dying. People in Tibet are dying, being imprisoned, just for disagreeing with China. And that's the truth. That is what is going on. Isn't it interesting that any attempts at informing people outside of Tibet regarding what is really going on is viewed as separatism and espionage? Isn't it interesting that you get jailed for that? Raids are done on monasteries to sentence over 20 monks under suspicion that they're all colluding with outside forces. Tibetan children also don't have the option to really become a monk or nun, or at least it isn't a safe option due to the brutalization and routine jailing of them. Their religion is dying because practicing it and showing the face of their spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, is also considered separatism. Could you imagine the face of Jesus Christ himself being banned right now? In conclusion, I think that my guess is that Tibet will only open up fully once the aggressive cultural assimilation by China has been completed. Once the entirety of Tibet is indoctrinated and adopted the Chinese narrative completely and wholly, will they allow journalists back in? As of right now, you can go to Tibet as a tourist, as long as you have a Chinese visa and a Tibet travel permit. Isn't that crazy? So yeah, that is my video, guys. This is something I've been passionate about ever since I started thinking about it, to be honest. It felt really nice to do a big deep dive into something like this. I think I learned a lot. I really enjoyed it, actually. That being said, next Monday we're probably gonna have a very chill episode and not do too much of like this. I think, yeah, this is definitely my biggest project since maybe like the Gamer Girls one. Yeah. Alright, well, I'm gonna go. I hope you had an educative time. And yeah, if you want to support me, like and subscribe. And I'll see you next week. Alright. Goodbye!